The Slav defense is known as one of the most solid opening systems for black against 1d4. It has always been at least one of the weapons in the opening repertoire of the best players in the world. And it starts with the d4, d5, c4, c6. Black needs to protect the pawn on d5, otherwise white just takes it. They play, let's say, something irrelevant, white takes it, knight goes out, and after queen moves back we can create full center with e4. But the question is, why would black want to do this and not something else like defending it with the e-pawn? The first reason to play c6 is to be able to replace the pawn on d5 with another one, so the center of black doesn't end up inferior. White continues by capturing on d5. Black simply recaptures and we get the symmetrical pawn structure. The second reason to play c6 is to create a serious threat of winning for free pawn on c4. Say I play h3, black takes, and after e3 pushes b5. You see how these pawns are actually defending each other. Overall, that means that white needs to be much more careful regarding that pawn on c4. Now, moving to the third reason, it is more standard way of defending the pawn on d5 with the e-pawn. The drawback is that this light square bishop becomes a very bad piece behind the pawn chain that black is forming here. You don't want to think that black is not intending to push e6. But before that, their intention is to go out with this bishop to f5 most likely and then to push the pawn. So what we need to be prepared for playing as white against the Slav defense is to be careful when it comes to this c4 pawn. Black is intending to capture it. Because of that problem on c4, some of the players would just go with the e3 here, but this move is locking in our bishop on the dark squares and we are not too happy with that. Now normally, you know that against the queen's gambit, we do not need to be that much concerned about this pawn on c4 and we can easily just continue with the knight c3. And many players having white's pieces in this position are treating the same way they treat the queen's gambit decline. But that's not really correct to do. Because here, if we continue with the move knight c3, you need to be expecting a certain kind of middle game in that case, possibly being down a pawn. And how we are going to end up down a pawn? Well, basically because black can take on c4. And after our move like e3, they can push b5. Very important detail here to notice is that the knight standing on c3 is not helping us to regain the pawn. It's quite counterintuitive, but it is making it more difficult. a4. In order to destroy the pawn on b5 that is defending the pawn on c4, and thus the bishop ends up at some point taking that pawn. But here, when the knight standing on c3, it's going to be possible for black to maybe play a move like b4. It is not putting us in a terrible situation, but we're going to be dealing with this knight instead of taking the pawn on c4. And then it kind of opens up some possibilities for black as well, which I don't think you'd like to be involving yourself in. So overall, I don't want to have my knight on c3 when this happens. Okay, so let's go back and regain the pawn without having any difficulties. And that can be done by placing the knight on f3. Here I'm going to strongly suggest that we just attack the pawn on c4 straight away with e3. They're going to be probably defending it with the pawn to b5. And whenever this happens, as we know, we're going to try to undermine this pawn formation by pushing a4. Not a secret at all anymore. e6, for example. What white can do is keep going with undermining these pawns, especially those two that I just highlighted. You can learn a lot by studying this position, trying to think of how to undermine the black's pawn formation. But I'm going to proceed now. You can use two moves actually. One is to immediately take on b5 and after c takes b, b3. And the point is, black is not going to be able to survive with the pawn on c4 if they keep it there. But if they take on b3, we have this in-between bishop b5 check, after which the pawn on b3 falls and we have better pawn structure. The other way of playing out the same kind of idea may be with the b3 immediately played. There is no big difference between those two. C takes b, a takes b, c takes b, and bishop ends up on b5 checking the black's king. We're in a good position after that. This all means that playing the move knight f3 helps us to regain the pawn in case black captures immediately on c4. So now we're going to go through the line that is involving bishop going to f5. This is supposed to be too early and it should be punished by white. But I can tell you that many players that I know would just react by continuing normal game. Let's say we're completely clueless of what's happening. We just continue with e3. We're not putting pressure by playing e3 on anything in black's camp. e6. Again, something that is very usual looking, knight c3. They're going to go with knight d7. Bishop e2 or bishop d3, doesn't matter. They're going to go with knight f6. So they're continuing the development. We're continuing as well. We'll castle and they'll place their bishop on d6. Or maybe play h6. This way, white cannot even harass the bishop on f5 with knight h4 because the bishop can just retreat to h7. Say we play b3. They just go bishop d6. Does this formation look like some other opening? Maybe you can reverse the colors and you may spot similarity with a certain opening system. Let's put the answer in the comment section while we are going to move on and just say that this is good for black. So let's go back and see where the mistake was made by white. Feels like this move bishop f5 started it all because it is announcing very active play by black. But the problem here is that white didn't react at all. We said their intention is to develop harmoniously with e6 with the bishop standing in front of their pawn chain, but they also left something unprotected. There is that kind of drawback of playing any move. Let's see what we can do about it. What is left here undefended is the pawn on b7. And now we are asking how can we make them pay for leaving this pawn undefended? Is there a way to put pressure on it? Okay, so the only way we can put pressure on b7 is using our queen, and we can do that by placing the queen on b3. But I'm gonna suggest you to first take on d5. Then we place the queen on b3. The b7 pawn is being attacked, and they have no easy way to protect it. Now, after b6, black may be kind of thinking that the problems are gone. Actually, the move b6 is weakening black's position terribly. And what is being weakened with this b pawn moving to the 6th rank? Again, asking that question of the consequences, what's being left undefended in the opponent's camp by their last move. In this case, these two squares. Let's imagine the situation of middle game where both players are actually fighting for the open c-file. This pawn on b6 is going to help us to get the c-file for ourselves because we're going to go with bishop a6. Of course, the knight's not going to be standing there. They want to develop. It's going to be standing either on c6 or on d7. We put the bishop on a6 and we're controlling the c8 square, and their rook cannot come there. But there is more, and there is really much more than that. And it's related with weakening the c6 square. You're going to imagine this bishop going to b5, delivering check at some point, and the knight going to d7, which is not, first of all, well placed there, but that's going to be just a little problem comparing with what's going to be happening after. Let's try this way. First, we're going to attack the d5 so that they push e6 and cut the way for the bishop to retreat to d7 and cover this diagonal that they just weakened. So let's provoke them to push e6. There are a couple of ways we can continue from here. One is to just try to build this pressure on c7 with our rook, with our bishop on f4 and the knight on b5 and things like that. But there is a better way, and the better way is aiming to strike against the black's king along this diagonal. How that's going to happen? We need to buy time by sacrificing a pawn, and that's going to be done by pushing e4. Say they take with the pawn. The point of e4 was bishop b5 check. Knight e7, which is going to be attacking one more time. The only way to protect d7 is by placing the other knight to f6. And I think there is a forced way here to win a piece by just going again against the d7 knight. Give yourself a couple of seconds or maybe pause the video. I'm going to just now continue and tell you that maybe we can focus on one of their defenders to eliminate the defender and just grab the knight on d7 for free. How to do it? Well, let's go with the bishop to g5. Say they defend it with the bishop e7. And now we can just take the knight on f6. And after g takes f, take the other one on d7, and we're winning a piece. You can try a little bit better maybe for black, but you're always going to end up losing something after b6. That's why you may see that many good players, if they end up in this bad position as black, they'd even decide to go back with the bishop to c8. You may ask, why not putting the queen on b6? Well, taking the pawn on d5 is there. If they put a queen on d7, defending b7 and keeping an eye on d5, this knight e5 is definitely making our position better. Let's move back. Maybe queen c8, hitting the bishop on c1. It's very odd looking square for the queen, and once we develop with the knight to c3 and put the bishop possibly on f4, we'll probably get a rook to c1 eyeing this queen along the c-file. And all that story that we had behind bishop f5 gives you an idea what's supposed to be done by black in this position. And that's to play just a move like knight f6. It is not leaving anything important unprotected. It is getting towards the center. It is protecting one of the key spots, the d5 pawn, in the early phase of the Slav. This is very important to guard. And later, maybe after e3, you may be happy to think of getting the bishop out to f5 or g4. Maybe in this case, it works better. Before we go, I'd like to actually ask you and test basically how well you understood so far what was discussed. What do you do as white in case the move bishop g4 happens here?